God bless everyone. And you know what I always say, rejoice and be glad in it, for today the Lord has made. I know I've been missing in action for a couple of weeks here, but we're going to continue on with Galatians, the study Bible of chapter 4. Chapter 4. And in first verse it says, "Now I say that as long as the heir is a child, he differs in no way from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. Instead, he is under guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were in slavery under the elements of the world. When the time came to completion, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, 'Abba, Father.' So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then God has made you an heir. But in the past, since you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's. But now, since you know God, or rather have become known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You are observing special days, months, seasons, and years. I am fearful for you, that perhaps my labor for you has been wasted. I beg you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I also became like you. You have not wronged me. You know that previously I preached the gospel to you because of the weakness of the flesh. You did not despise or reject me, though my physical condition was trial for you. On the contrary, you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. Where then is your blessing? Where then is your blessing? For I testify to you that, if possible, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. So then I have become your enemy, because I told you the truth. They court you eagerly, but not for good. They want to exclude you from me, so that you would pursue them. But it is always good to be pursued in a good manner, and not just when I am with you. My children, I am again suffering labor pains, for until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be with you right now and change my tone of voice, because I don't know what to do about you." Let's continue on explaining what the first, basically I'll divide this into two sections. What the first section that Apostle Paul was talking about. He said in verse 1 that, like, as long as you are a heir is a child, he differs in no way from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. Basically, they were the law. Remember, Apostle Paul was speaking to the Galatians because there was legalists involved, basically people that want to incorporate, like, this is a recap from the previous chapters, want to incorporate the legalism, circumcision, the Jewish rituals from the Old Testament, which is the law. So the Apostle Paul said that you were a children before. Basically, we were waiting for Jesus Christ to come, and basically in verse 4 it says, "When the time came to completion, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoptions as sons." So we were adopted through Jesus Christ. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, "Abba, Father." So you are no longer a slave, but a son. You see, before we were a slave under the law, the Old Testament fathers, the Old Testament people, they needed to do the law to please God. And now, since we are not living under the law but grace, he is saying that you are the heir of the promise of what Abraham was said to him through God. And if you continue on in verse 8, "But in the past, since you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's." In the past, they were the Galatian people. They were pagan. They were basically people that were serving other gods and were worshiping other gods. But that's why the Apostle Paul said, continue on saying that he preached the gospel to them. And he was basically, in verse number 12, it says, I beg you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I also became like you. You have not wronged me. Basically, when he did his missionary trip, when he went to Galatia, and he preached the gospel to them, and he built up this church that he's writing to them. And remember, the Galatian church at this time, they were putting their eyes on another gospel and another good news. But that's why in the first chapter, Apostle Paul said, not that there is another gospel, but they put their back to God. They give their back to God and gave their back to the real true gospel. And it says that even when he was doing the missionary trip and he reached the Galatians, that they never wronged him. They received them, and they received them as a blessing, even through his physical condition. Now, I was doing a little studying of what this physical condition might be, but the physical condition of it might be that the Apostle Paul probably have ophthalmia, which is basically an inflammation. I had to write it down because that was a really difficult word to remember. But it was basically inflammation of the eyes. Now, does the Bible say it? No, it does not. But, that's why I did back study on what probably it might be. Which I remember, I looked it up. And I remember when I was little, I used to have that, the inflammation of the eye. And it's not really fun, because every morning you wake up and you feel that you can't open your eyes because it's full of, like what we call it, boogies, eye boogies. That's what we call it. And it's full of your eyes, that you can't open your eyes. You have to give it a couple minutes for you to actually, and put water in it so you could actually open your eyes completely and take all that eye boogie out. It's a really horrible condition. Thank God, through the years, basically I didn't have that anymore. But that's why the Galatians didn't reject Apostle Paul when he went to visit them, and they actually received them with open arms. And that's why the Apostle Paul wrote this letter, because the Apostle Paul loved that church. And he continues saying that, so then, have I become your enemy because I told you the truth? Basically, have you rejected the gospel that I preached to you? And then he continues on saying that, but it is always good to be pursued in a good manner, not just when I am with you. My children, I am again suffering labor pains for you until Christ is formed in you. That emotion, that, the letter that the Apostle Paul is basically writing this letter with, is just, I guess, the Bible says that God is a God of jealousy, and the jealousy the Apostle Paul most likely had for the Galatians trying to put their back, giving their back to God, is tremendous, because in the last verse it says, I would like to be with you right now and change my tone of voice because I don't know what to do about you. See, the emotion the Apostle Paul had towards these Galatians, that they basically gave their back to the one and true gospel, to God that saved them, that through the promise they received the promise of what God told Abraham. And he continues saying to them, to basically, you have a promise from God through Jesus Christ. And that is what the Study Bible chapter 4, the first section, what I have. So I hope you guys are blessed. God bless you. I'll see you in the next Study Bible.